This marriage had started out as a long-term relationship, and all he desired was her, Lacey, who knew of his lies. But what made her heart beat so hard? It all started the moment she was asked to give up. Lacey was a major star in a secret organization that had been flawlessly playing roles for clients for the past 12 years. She was close to freedom, becoming a fugitive in the blink of an eye, and not even tears could bear all the weight of that burden. Once on the ship, Lacey was discovered to be a stowaway, causing a stir. But of all places, the heroine met him here. However, judging by the man's reaction, he was only happy to see her face. His name was Halid Sirim Hartman, a prince of the Irina Empire, who was visiting the Weldon Kingdom for trading purposes. However, Lacey had already heard that he had managed to sign a trade agreement. She was sure that Halid would turn her in to strengthen ties with Weldon, but his interest was growing, for he wished the girl to play a different role for him. Who knew it would turn out this way? As long as the fugitive was fairly compensated, she would be able to do anything, though that didn't discourage him in the slightest. Halid wished the stranger to be the bride he had fallen in love with at first sight. And it was very strange, for it was unclear what the man intended, but the prince gave her a choice. In the end, he heard consent on her part, and now they were going to raise the sails immediately. That was how their marriage began. Everything was ready for their return to Irina. However, there was something that needed to be finalized, namely to seal the new union. Veronica Hillsdale was summoned to a trial where she was promised to be executed. The judge asked the sinner for the last word, eyeing her like a predator. What was she supposed to say? Was the rain washing away the weariness and tears from her sinful body? Could it be? Is a love a sin? She wanted only to love the prince, and constrained as she was, she admitted it without a shred of fear. She remained impenetrable to the very end, so that there were whispers and exclamations all around. It was madness. Even the count did not come to the trial. It must have been a shock to hear such a thing from his daughter. The judge ordered this woman, who still kept wishing the prince to be happy, to be taken away. Except she would be much happier. After a while, she was ordered to hurry up and go inside. And yet her acting was excellent. The judge thought it was superb. And if both parties were happy, their contract was over, so the father had to pay. No, not the father, the buyer. Well, it was now known that Veronica Hillsdale had never existed. The girl didn't even know who her daddy even was. She had once been sold to Hung Sin-so, and this happened when she was only 10. The girl was met by a madam who thought she was nice enough, and she would only get better with age. Lacey was good at many things, so she asked the woman to see her as much more than just an attractive face. And that only amused her. She even got a question out of her, according to which the girl knew what funhouse was. Her first role was a random passerby who witnessed a crime. From now on, the protagonist became an actor, and her no matter what role it is, she will be obliged to play. The heir who thought he was dead, the groom's new hidden child, the Marcus's youngest maid. Still, her skills were exceptional. There were a lot of poison worm and body collector in the excitement center. The actress had the highest reputation, so Madame promised the clients wouldn't regret it. On this day, the woman received a strange request for adoption. It seemed to Lacey that it was not revenge or treason. She was being asked to be someone's daughter. It was payment for her 10 years of work. It was rather suspicious and tempting, though, because the protagonist still wanted to cover her mother's debts. And if she succeeded in doing so, she would be done with the role. In the end, Lacey would be free. For the next 6 years, her goal was clear: to make Prince I the most powerful heir to the throne. And her client, and now father, would poke the noble lady with his finger and make her the prince's bride. That's when this body would disappear. First, there was no one in Weldon who knew her, because Veronica appeared very suddenly. The prince even wanted to sing a song together. Everything was going according to plan, and now the girl promised to make him king. except that there was an unexpected competitor. The Count got a girl of angelic appearance out of nowhere. And then the prince stopped falling for the charms of Lacey, who was blinded by jealousy. She wished to poison the girl, after which society called her the cruelest woman of all time. The plan failed, and the threat to the prince's life was a source of trouble. The Count was upset that he had raised his own wrongly, and even though he had status, there was nothing he could do about it. It was left up to the law. It seemed that the story was over, but Lacey was back. Madame should not have worried, because the protagonist was confident in her skills, except that she was already wanted. Lacey has been stabbed in the back, namely by her client father, and it's not clear how it could have happened, because the protagonist even had thoughts that it was she who did something wrong, perhaps by playing around and disrupting the plans of the Count himself. But even so, she disagreed, according to his plan. The first prince endowed with many talents was supposed to rise higher and higher. He had even mapped out his future by picking a bride. But then the villainess, Veronica, appeared saying that the prince would belong to her alone. This is how the happy ending was supposed to be. The status of countess can always be obtained or restored with the help of the groom. Lacey only wanted to pay off her debts and then go to a place where no one knows about her. Then all that would be left would be to enjoy the second act in the play, her own life. The finale would have made her happy, but there was one but. The girl did everything as commanded, except that something went wrong. And yes, 5 years of trouble gave her a reward of only 10 million gold. Madame thought that because she was too into the role, that might have scared the Count. In any case, this lady could get double the reward if she gave up Lacey, except that the protagonist still had debts, and now they could get rid of her like garbage. Of course, it was unfair, but the red-haired fury only wanted to save her own skin. Now all Lacey had to do was walk to the port. She was being released thanks to a deep bond, but someday she would still have to answer for her deeds. And afterward, at this very port, they began to hunt her down, wanting her 10 million gold. Lacey was able to disguise herself with magic thanks to Madame's mercy, but children know no pity. They tried their best to intimidate her by promising to spend her bounty wisely. After all, the men were still willing to hand her over to execution. The Count had put out an ab on her to keep his name pure. There was nowhere to run. She still wouldn't admit her guilt, and the client was so displeased that he put a bounty on her head. Freedom was almost in Lacey's hands, so it was too soon to give up. She was helped by a sudden rainstorm, which confused her pursuers into thinking she had jumped into the water. However, the heroine turned out to be much smarter, and it almost stopped dripping. She was lucky, but she lost all her belongings. It didn't take long, but this is the shit Madame had in mind. As long as no one recognized her, except that her presence had not gone unnoticed, and now she was wanted, and the stowaway inside the cabin was greeted very warmly. 2 years ago, a delegation from the Irina Empire was staying, so Lacey's client had asked her to be prepared. In particular, the girl would have to take care of Prince Halid, the delegation's representative. Once again, the Count grumbled at his flawless daughter. Her father worried too much, as if she had once disappointed him. It should have been made clear at once, because the man was interested in a good relationship with the prince. The delegation would have to bring things from the west, so the Earl couldn't miss the opportunity. Even though Lacey was clever, she should not let her guard down, for the prince was not an easy opponent. Rumors began to circulate in high society that the ship was covered in gold and the delegation numbered 100 people. A miracle did occur that day. The mere appearance alone captivated everyone. Prince Halid captivated everyone, but only Lacey was set on a plan. All she had to do was to fail the request. And while she was in the clouds, a man came closer to her and called her a dog. So, who'd have thought that 2 years later they'd meet again, but on a ship? Halid was glad to meet Veronica that even trying to hide this fact was useless for her. Now she realized whose ship it was. Her body trembled at such a blatant mistake, but the prince continued to press and ask questions. It was getting dangerous, but it was worth a try. Lacey cupped his neck with her hands to use the paralyzing poison under her fingernails. Halid intercepted her brushes, making her think she'd been figured out. Well, he'd asked for it. Using her charms, the protagonist pulled the man to the couch in a dance of kissing as the guards entered the room. Halid, however, did not give her a head start and played along perfectly. Somehow, it seemed so natural. And even his reaction was a turn-on. The guards blushed at the embarrassing scene, but were glad that the gentleman was all right. Simone explained that if what they had seen was true, they needed to leave quickly because meeting a mutant was an unprecedented occurrence. However, they would have to wait before reporting it, as the prince was a bit busy. Though just a second later, His Highness came out of his quarters and ordered them to stop searching and hurry up and set sail. The authority was now entrusted to Simone. Lacey, on the other hand, was being as cautious as possible. Even her appearance alone said that she had been through something terrible. A cunning plan to create sympathy appeared in her mind. She made a guilty grimace and said in her defense that she had messed up the ship. Halid didn't believe her game though, because he already knew that his guest was a stowaway hiding from the wanted. She need not deceive the prince, for he and Veronica knew each other well. It was hard to forget their first meeting, especially when a man calls a girl a dog. Lacey hasn't gone off script, but if she keeps getting pissed off like this, she's going to have a hard time holding back. Halid wasn't used to such words yet. I think he confused the word with puppy. Veronica snickered, admiring the man's superior vocabulary, who didn't even need a translator. But he should be more perceptive. She'd gotten so worked up that even the prince had intervened in their quarrel. Halid trembled at her accusations, but then another heroine appeared. The one with the angelic appearance. She said, as if the others hadn't seen her, that there had been a misunderstanding between them. Fortunately, the negotiation was completed. The Count alone thought Lacey's position was correct in treating Naled as an enemy. If he were to give his preference to her, it would be the best outcome. Even though the first impression wasn't great, the game turned out to be excellent. Veronica drew the attention of both of them with the click of her heels and announced that the barbarian wrapped in gold remained a barbarian. It was as if the man couldn't find clothes out of all his gold, or he just liked naughty things. If Lacey had known they were in the rub again. And after such a long time, Halid wouldn't call her a silent person. Her hands reached for the gorgeous earrings, causing the magic to now disappear. The magical item left a trace of magic. And because of her burden, the protagonist pretended to be Veronica. She tried to hide, but magically, the prince recognized her identity and the ability of the jewelry. How did he do it? Now Halid only wished to know her true intentions. Was she a night thief or just running away? Previously, she had been loyal to her master like a dog. And, frowning, he mouthed the name Daniel Le Pen Weatherline, which belonged to the first prince. It was advantageous to him since the one for whose head the bounty was placed boarded the ship. Because of her service to the prince, Veronica threw herself into the hellfire, which seemed like a no-brainer for her. Her acting is truly superb. Halid was mistaken, because his guest was only acting in her own best interest. However, he saw through her pretense, so he won't listen anymore, except which role is more interesting. All he had to do was make a choice, and Lacey would fulfill it. The prince laughed at her words, as if her hanging on to Daniel was not a game. Except it was the truth, the guarantor of which she couldn't tell. It sounded like Halid was trying to poach her. The heroine wouldn't lie though, and added that payment was very important to her. Gathering his thoughts, the man rarely took a sip and explained that in the middle of the desert, in his empire, there was a beautiful city where there were rooms of gold and silver and even sapphires and rubies. She would be allowed to choose anyone. Lacey played the villain perfectly, so the role of the bride will seem much easier for her. Namely, the maid he fell in love with at first sight. But if she didn't like being a maid, she could be a stowaway. If there was difficulty in choosing, Again, Lacey could try to escape. Yes, and he liked the method. Especially when the girl put her arms around his neck like this and then kissed him. She could play anything, so after a short pause, the actress gave her answer. Let their journey begin. The ship was returning to Irina, which was rather sudden. Simone, on the other hand, thought there was no reason to delay, for the prince had found what he had been looking for a long time. The goal at Weldon had been reached. Something was stopping the soldier, after all. He couldn't find his missing sister in this place. Of course, his reaction said otherwise, but the man thought the trip was fun. There was something else. Lana caught a spy. It appeared that he was after them for Irina himself. Moreover, the spy dared to try to seduce His Highness. Except it wasn't a good move, since the prince wouldn't even look at women. Lacey had been suspicious since yesterday. She hadn't signed the contract yet, so this was overkill. There was so much food put in front of her that made the girl fearful about the presence of poison. Although, one could taste a little of it. And it was delicious. Questions rang out in her mind. Why hadn't he set sail, as if waiting for Lacey to come aboard? Was there some other reason for leaving the kingdom so hastily? And why had the diplomats shown no respect? Halid appeared suddenly, hoping she was enjoying her meal. By the way, she needn't have worried about that. Lacey invited him to join as she waited for the conversation. She needed the truth before signing the contract. Was the man across from her hiding something? The prince denied it, but that was only a small part of it, because from the beginning his target had been her. Halid had not intended to sail away so quickly, but what he had sought had come to him. So now there was no need for further hesitation. But now, already Lacey was tensing up, as the man was related to the actor in Fiore. The reason why he recognized Veronica and treated her without hostility, the reason why he trusted the assignments without even checking the abilities. Now, she understood a little. Halid wanted the actress who played the villainess Veronica. However, how could he not recognize her? Among the Fiore children, she was the only one who had received a magic item from Madame, and it was a secret. Madame had sold it, because it could no longer be used at Weldon. Was her acting really good? Lacey bowed her head in chagrin, and even asked how much it had cost her. Halid, on the other hand, was either playing dumb or really didn't realize what he'd done. The protagonist had priced herself dearly, though. She made it to the port sooner than she expected. Despite getting out as discreetly as possible, she was immediately chased as if she had been nudged. Now it was clear. They were luring her onto the ship. The prince felt a little awkward, which Lacey began to object to. They called it being tricked in Weldon. The man was confused at all, since they were talking about different things. The girl understood, figuring he was sending her to be more polite. However, a professional like her could see right through that. Even the kiss was followed by an instant reaction. A person with a developed sixth sense. Halid didn't mind when someone took the initiative, but he still didn't give up his superiority. So why was he so good? Lacey made sure the man lusted for her, so she could take advantage of it. He was amused by her resistance to answering questions, but they should have gone back to discussing the contract, and she shouldn't have given in to her emotions. It was only a formality since Halid had hired her, which meant their partnership had now begun. Simone, however, was clearly enraged by this contact. After all, Crown Princess was more than just words. In the future, she and Halid would work together to protect the peace and quiet of the Irina Empire. Then where would this alliance end? Would he let Lacey go? The prince did not wish that, but asked his aide to speak more quietly, away even if the girl did not know their language. Halid agreed with her words. He didn't know the details, but it looked like she was an actress, which meant she could play absolutely any role. Of course, it was very interesting, but Simone was curious as to how the prince had agreed to it in the first place. However, he was curious himself. The man couldn't understand what was in her head, so he went for it. Either way, it had to do with his purpose. It was time to pick on and tell the Crown Princess, and his right-hand man could be offered a solution to the problem. Khalid was forbidden to talk about the fact that they had already met 10 years ago and made a promise to each other. Lacey was worried about the rightness of her choice. And now she was beginning to realize how far away Irina was. Since crossing the sea was very dangerous for the people of Weldon, Irina was a place that was hard to get to, and even the Count was cowering since the actress dared to disappear without his permission. And Madame stopped taking new orders, instead offering something more interesting. Perhaps that would be better for Lacey? At least no one would find her, and she would have a wonderful life. But of all the roles, why did she get the bride? Even that was given to her with difficulty because of the vivid emotions. For example, from the memories of last night. Moreover, why did he suddenly need a bride? Simone suggested his master tell the girl about something in a couple of days, but Khalid considered it useless. In 3 days, they would reach neutral waters, so the ban would no longer apply. Except that Lacey didn't even remember him, so if the man told her what had happened 10 years ago, she would hate him. That was probably why he looked upset, and why Simone wished he could do something about it. But the prince had already thought of something. He wanted to seduce her and make the girl stay with him after the end of the contract. Even his assistant was surprised at such vulgar language. Now that would not be an easy task, because Lacey was not simple. However, this was already the responsibility of Simone, who did not understand His Highness at all. Not to mention, it was the first time he had seen him so troubled. Khalid even asked for advice on whether he should have walked in front of her in clothes or naked. Lacey even looked like she liked bossy men, but she might actually prefer more modest ones. He didn't look like himself at all. Surely he wasn't possessed by a demon. If Khalid acted like that, it would only scare the crown princess away. However, Simone wasn't sure, so the prince only sighed heavily, especially since he was destroying his ideas of seducing the protagonist. Lacey had been through a lot, so the man regretted not being able to erase her sad past. There was no point in that, though, because they could build a future together. Even if she didn't remember the promise, even if she never remembered what they had talked about, Khalid would never leave her again. He would make sure she enjoyed all the delights of life, whether it was food, expensive clothes, or jewelry. After all, Lacey is his fiancée. Except there was another side to it. One that was against their happiness. And these people wished to pierce a lonely man's heart with loneliness. In her dreams, Lacey had nightmares. And just as she was awakening, there was a knock at her door. As it turned out, she had been put on guard while the prince was taking a bath. It was just in time, for she would be able to do some preliminary research. The girl gave him a radiant smile and asked permission to ask him a few questions. A favorable answer was heard, so it didn't take long for Lacey to ask. Compared to Weldon, what was the social status of the women in Irina? The man explained that the couple consulted about the family name when they married, and often the woman became the head of the family. However, he did not know if the prince's consort would be entrusted with public affairs, or if she did diplomatic work at all. This made him blush, embarrassed by his ignorance. Khalid visited her after a while. Lacey called him closer to end the negotiations, but for some reason the prince was tense. The same could be said for her, for the girl believed that Irina was supposed to have contracts. According to the contract, the parties were obliged to faithfully fulfill the role of lovers at first sight. Secondly, Party A protects Party B from revealing their identity in the Weldon Kingdom. Then, the former not only prevents Party B's necessary information, but also provides support. Fourth, upon successful completion of the task, Party B is paid a reward of 10 million gold in cash or written statement. Fifth, after completion, Party A no longer seeks Party B. And last, the actions of the contract must be precise. But for some reason, there was nothing here about what would happen if it failed. Lacey agreed to make it clear, though she tried to leave it out. She wrote in the 7th clause that if the assignment failed, but Party A could ask anything they wanted from the contractor as compensation. He seemed to like that. Even if the contract was going to be long, Lacey hoped it wouldn't last longer than 2 years, because that risked a stab in the back. Khalid thought she was exhausted from multiple contracts, but the girl was sure that 2 years was too long and might raise suspicion because they wouldn't have children. The prince clearly wasn't expecting such a response. However, Lacey thought that having birth control would be a good idea because she refused to have unprotected liaisons. His Highness gave no answer, but only wanted to hurry up and sign this contract. Now that they are together, can they do everything that normal couples do? She had the power to do anything with that piece of paper, just like he had with her. It didn't last long for this fun, because the protagonist deserved to be heard before they started. She was very tired, so Khalid had only to enjoy her sleeping form. Lana, on the other hand, begged in every possible way and even kneeled at Simone's feet to meet the crown prince's consort. She had been refused several times and this time too, but now the twin brother had already stepped in. The frontierswoman wanted to meet this girl and gain her favor, which wasn't even surprising to the others. After all, she was the best at catching mutants. Lana had fought in the attack on Sarajev, so the prince trusted her. By the way, this desire had occurred to others as well, but it took a special occasion to meet her. There were already those who had received her favor. Sana explained that he, born into a poor family and tried to gain the favor of the imperial family through service, so they would definitely correct their behavior. Simone personally promoted him, so asked him not to be cruel. Meanwhile, Lacey refreshed herself in the imperial bath that even the poison from under her fingernails was washed away. Khalid was already aware of her difficult journey and he was glad she was relieved. Though the protagonist was angered by the behavior of the maids who spoke a common language that made her unable to understand their speech. But they cared for her so much that it was like heaven. One of them said that they liked the appearance of the prince's consort, and that was the reason for the uproar. And the man himself appeared very suddenly. As he said, Lacey would get everything she needed, but she said that things were moving too fast. Khalid took advantage of her good mood and leaned over her confused face. The prince wanted to apologize for last night, especially since they hadn't been able to get some things done because of her wanting to sleep. Lacey, on the other hand, said she still wasn't ready, however he saw otherwise. It was just the two of them in the room, but it was getting harder and harder for the man to wait. Suddenly, she noticed something in the corner that made her start to shiver. It showed the tail of an animal that Lacey had seen for the first time. A tigress. Unlike Weldon, there was still magic in Irina, and every inhabitant had abilities. When abilities are perfected, you can make protective images called Teru. The world abroad could not show Teru to anyone, however Zeppi would not harm her. But now it was necessary to finish what he had started, something Khalid was very eager for. However, it seemed to the protagonist that she didn't want to, but that wasn't the case. The stranger's hands were so gentle that her heart was pounding fast, and the kisses were so sweet, but there was one problem. Lacey could only close her eyes and play lover, but not make love, because she didn't know how. Sometime in the past, it had been explained to her and the other girls that their main mission was to act. To truly act. To truly act, you had to put your soul into it, and that was hard. They might even get their hearts broken, but they weren't supposed to let that happen. So currently, the protagonist was resisting as she refused to make unprotected liaisons. However, Khalid proved to be prepared. It was about the bracelets. Even if a girl only wore one, she wouldn't be able to conceive children, and she wore as many as 3 and said she was going to the bathroom, which he thought was a hint. That explained the maid's reaction. Lacey couldn't even dream that the bracelets were magical birth control items. Khalid picked her up in his arms, deciding that the girl would be more willing on the bed. But she saw fit to add another clause to the contract, namely, there would be no gratuitous sexual intercourse. After all, they were only playing an inseparable couple, which meant they didn't need to be a couple for real. It was obvious. Even though Khalid was not happy, he still agreed to her wishes, and now all that was left was to sign and choose a name for her, because her real name was kept secret. That was all that protected her. Nereis. The prince had named her after a nymph who lived in the sea. His smile made the protagonist embarrassed, causing something to tighten in her chest. Luckily, things remained calm about the prisoner because Zeppi had intimidated him very badly. Sana apologized to Simone since he hadn't considered using magic, but it had happened so fast, which caused the entire reputation of the guard to crumble. The border guard intended to interrogate the girl, and yes, Simone was convinced that it would be over when they returned. At least it was clear that depriving her of her magic would be the worst thing possible than death. They left the dungeon, and Simone inquired about Lana, who had beaten her brother because of her activism. Soon, their ship would be approaching the border, so guards had to be beefed up. And in this dark place, only the clinking of heavy chains escorted them to their backs. Simone greeted the heroine, feeling awkward, but Lacey balked, for all was well. For some reason, scenes of her and the prince appeared in the man's mind, so he flinched in surprise when she thanked him. Halid's right hand was grateful for the favor of his lord's bride. But Halid himself was annoyed by this talk, so ordered his servant to do as he should. Lacey began to sleep badly due to her poor health, so Simone began to examine her, though more likely to paw at her face. He was concerned about how the girl was tolerating the journey, for her body was weak. Halid asked what she needed besides good food, but that was enough. The protagonist, on the other hand, realized that it would be useful to get to know this man, so she was even lucky enough to be alone with him. Her little tongue wondered if the prince had said anything. Simone explained that Halid would become the new lord of Suryev, and she in turn would become the empress of the Irina Empire. Moreover, he had heard that love at first sight had sprung up between the pair, and Lacey knew their language poorly, but loved red wine. They had even been ordered to make a menu based on flavors and nutrition. Only she didn't like the idea. The protagonist did not understand why there were no questions for her. As it turned out, the sailor who saw her boarding the ship did not remember the face. Moreover, most didn't know the universal language, so they didn't know what had happened at Weldon. For example, about the wanted flyers. Simone knew Veronica had a better command of the universal language than Halid, so he knew exactly what the villainess was talking about. And he wasn't interested at all in who she was. However, the man was ready to prove it indeed. Lacey, not thinking long, announced that she was counting on him in the future, which made Simone blurt out her cuteness. The girl also asked about the bracelet, which, as it became known, only the prince wore on the ship, because this precious object was made especially for her. But if he wore a pair of those things, did that mean Halid used them with others? Simone volunteered to tell more about this man. Halid was from the Imperial Hartmann family ruling in Irina. He was considered the most powerful heir to the throne, very clever and talented in battle. Even the guy's appearance was unique, which caused girls to constantly fall in love with him. Yet he never had a relationship. He never had a fiancée, a mistress, or just a girl. But maybe he had a man in that case. Lacey didn't know him at all, which gave her a strange feeling after hearing this. She was curious how everyone reacted to him so abruptly declaring someone a bride. Of course, everyone was only surprised, but no one doubted his choice, because someone still managed to steal His Highness's heart, which remained unshaken. But because of the ban, Simone could not tell about his abilities, although he was still convinced that everyone fell in love with Halid just by looking into his eyes. As the guy noticed, the two of them became close quite quickly, and he began to press his gaze on his assistant. Couldn't stand it, and decided to save his reputation. And Lacey thought he was calm, except that the tension of the people in front of him kept growing. Halid interrupted them at the most interesting part, but she needed information on the role, so he would allow them to talk some more, but should have kept their distance. It looked like he was jealous. The man was slightly tense as the prisoner tried to escape. She had broken the cell, injured a few guards, except what was the purpose? It was strange how the woman was able to pull this off. After all, she had her hands and feet shackled. Perhaps she had an accomplice. Sana offered to try her immediately and not take her along, but His Highness was convinced otherwise. However, the trial would take place in Irina. Right now, next to the protagonist, he was smiling because he had made the right decision. Moreover, Khaled saw her showing enthusiasm. It was all because Simone had given her some rather useful information. However, that wasn't his only talent. Yes, and she was having a hard time not working. Lacey wished that the client had sincerely thanked her for her efforts. The man had said he wouldn't skimp on anything, starting with support. So what did she want? It was obvious. Lacey had always wanted to be free. But if that wish came true, what would she do next? Debt. Free in a place where the echoes of the past wouldn't catch up with her. That's where her heart was drawn to. The protagonist gritted her teeth, bringing herself back to reality. So all she asked for was money. However, Simone and Sana had already sensed the purity of her mana. The crown princess was indeed special. Even her eye color was unique. Even the kind words spoken to her unknowingly carried magic, so he couldn't wait for her to show her full potential. It had been so long since Simone had fallen under the mercy of such a person that he practically let a tear fall. Oh, and the prince had been right all along. Now Sana, too, understood why he had been so insistent on going to Weldon. The princess's presence was tantamount to that of the high priest, but that wasn't all. Perhaps she had purification abilities. Simone instantly remembered that his companion needed to finish his rounds, so he quickly said goodbye. But would Lacey be all right? After all, she had come aboard without knowing anything. The prince must remain on good terms with the princess to explain everything. Except he'd turned his fears into reality. Khaled had ruined everything. When the girl mumbled that she was only interested in money, the man expected more because she didn't need him. Lacey was going to work according to the pay, but Khaled still kept insisting that he would give her more. But she was adamant. Simone was now panicking as well since the plan was to seduce this lady. Judging the prince, he had only made things worse, although the man himself realized that it would be difficult, even if it wasn't that difficult. Meanwhile, the protagonist reflected on the fact that she always strived for freedom, but thought about what would happen afterward. Probably the reason was the fact that her whole life was decided for her. Only for a moment did he come to mind. The one who had given her a chance at freedom. The one who had looked at her so warmly. The one who had called her Neres, yet love was not part of their contract. Especially, the feeling wasn't necessary for someone who already had everything. Her peaceful reflection was interrupted by a tiger whose size made Lacey cringe. She had only asked for some quiet time, but Zeppi, who only wanted to leave, was interested in her. Was this how one could live with a beast? And salvation seemed to come in the person of Khaled, who noticed how they were starting to get used to each other. He hummed, for it was clear from the princess's screams that she had come around. During their conversation, her state was depressed, so His Highness wanted to save her from her fear. He wanted to ask for one thing, and that was part of their contract. They need to ask for a blessing together, and Lacey was not to do anything but just stay by her fiancé's side. After a while, a lot of jewelry and jewels ended up on the main character's body. She knew that sailors were superstitious, but she didn't think she was so. The ritual for crossing the border of the empire was too unexpected. Khaled had explained that night that if they didn't do the ritual to honor the Lord of the Seas, they might encounter bad weather and go off course, perhaps even get shipwrecked. Lacey, on the other hand, wondered if the ship's crew members would accept her. At least things were going smoothly at the moment. Then that's when the prince showed up and said that the heroine wouldn't have to do anything. But his sudden movements made her emotional, even though he was only going to fix the necklace. It was normal to be nervous before meeting the Sea Lord. Khaled didn't let her have the last word and rushed off, leaving her questions unanswered. Time to get back to work. It would rain during the ceremony, so Simone was afraid the princess would be shocked. But His Highness was convinced that some things were better seen in person. Finally, It was time to show himself. The protagonist was beautiful, and the fresh air she missed so much added to her charm. And the sound of a dozen people bowing down to her and daring to raise their heads without her permission was ear-splitting. That was what Simone was talking about. To be honest, it was even a little frightening to think they bowed to her as soon as she came out. Left alone and gazing at the sea surface, Lacey had brought a thin cloak that was much warmer. The thing was a magical artifact. What was she surprised at, though, when she was all about those magical things? Zeppi appeared behind her back, the mere sight of which made the protagonist shiver. Lacey came to her senses in time, because she was supposed to be the perfect princess, so she played the role perfectly. Such a change, even the tiger was surprised. The girl just decided not to look at him. However, the animal was the first to approach her. No one had ever seen Zeppi behave like this with anyone but a prince before. Now, no one doubted the authenticity of the bride, who was holding back her tears from the last strength. But the same sound and the same bowing awakened hope in her. Halid appeared just in time. Her heart began to beat fast at the mere sight of him. The ceremony was about to begin, but the crew members were still looking at their princess, who looked like a sea fairy. Khalid held out his hand to her, saying he almost bought it. He whispered that for a split second he thought Lacey was happy to see him. Her acting was proving to be perfect, just as she had said it would be. Except she wasn't faking it. The protagonist turned her head and saw all these gifts, against which she herself was barely visible. And they did a good job. Khalid hadn't said it was going to be that big, so Lacey questioned whether it was really necessary. The prince had insisted that she would just need to be near him. The couple was approached by Simone, who held out a green sprig. Afterward, the groom asked his bride not to be nervous. What could this possibly mean? Moreover, the servants were also participating in the ceremony, and everyone was looking somewhere in the distance. After the prince's right hand announced someone's arrival, the ship started rocking. There was a horrible rumbling in my ears, followed by a strong wind that began to blow me off my feet. Luckily, Khalid was holding the hand of his princess, who thought it was a storm. But the unseen began to happen. The water began to emit a bright light. Lacey didn't understand what was happening at that moment, but one thing was certain. There was something under the ship, and it was looking at them. The protagonist clung to His Highness, who, by the way, wasn't bothered at all. This lull didn't last long, because a horrible scream abruptly appeared and disappeared. Everything was all right now. The ship's crew began to sing, and Khalid looked so brave even without his armor and sword. He ordered something to open with a sharp look, then took her hand and asked her to trust him. At the time, Lacey was unaware of the meaning of this strange ritual, which she thought was mere superstition. She didn't know about the creature she was about to encounter, but more importantly, it was the day the protagonist met a part of herself she didn't even know she had. Did Khalid know about it? It took her a while to realize it. The man definitely knew better than she knew herself. At last, their ship had arrived in Irina. The space was illuminated by a bright glow, and the crewmen in their songs praised the one who shone brightly from the summit of their divine land. If he could fly but vanquish evil, and the plains would light up with fresh green, then all creatures will begin to praise his greatness. This song, in a language she did not know why, was clear to her. Lacey saw the one for whom they dedicated their song. Everyone lived for him. So she was glad to come to this magical place. But suddenly she fainted. The girl had many things she wanted to ask, but first Khalid had to get her down on her feet. Everything was fine now, however, he refused. The man did as he wished, however, and ignored her demands by sitting her down on his lap. Even Simone played along, telling him that it was better this way. After all, she had lost a lot of strength. Given the power of synastry between her and the prince, the closer they were, the better, Lacey wondered. Through her embarrassment, what it was on his shoulder. It was his Taru. Simone had managed to summon her after crossing over. She already knew about that. Then the only thing left to ask about was synastry. Briefly, The mana they possessed was extremely compatible. So much so that being around each other would benefit them. For the people of Irina, Halid didn't let him finish, figuring that learning more would keep Lacey awake. Simply put, Irina is a land of mages. The end. Now, she should have been allowed to rest, making sure to pay attention to food and even a glass of water. However, the protagonist demanded to tell her everything in detail. She knew they were on the border. Did it really have anything to do with what the girl had seen? Halid became nervous, and Simone took the initiative to tell as short a story as possible. The border referred to the waters between the central continent and the Irina Empire. In simple words, it was the place where the transition between the part of the world where magic disappeared and where it remained was located. They had crossed the border a few minutes ago, and that the was a dragon protecting the balance. The part they were sailing through belonged to its domain. The creature's name was Agir. People rarely saw his true form, as the creature was usually shown as a shadow. Apparently, he became curious to get a glimpse of the main character. Khalid asked him to stop, as these stories would not internalize her but frighten her, except there was excitement in her eyes, so she asked him to tell more tomorrow. Simone, on the other hand, was glad she turned out all right. Lacey would easily adjust to life at Sarayev's, that there was nothing to worry about. As soon as the man was out the door, His Highness lifted his princess into his arms and set her on the bed, figuring her sleep would be more sound if he wasn't around. Lacey, however, thought the opposite. It was as if Halid could never bring Halid here because of her. And since the conversation had started, she wanted to know how many there were. The man didn't immediately realize that it was about mistresses. The protagonist, on the other hand, was convinced it was just a game, but she wanted to know how his fake fiancé was. This conversation clearly infuriated him as Halid covered her with his body, pinning her to the bed and demanding to look at him. He asked her to stop doubting his words because he really didn't have any other woman besides her, and this behavior was only making him worse. Rarely leaning away, the man apologized for pouncing so harshly and decided to leave her alone. Lacey didn't know why she had done so. It was just that Halid looked like he was in pain. All her thoughts were occupied with was that she didn't want to hurt him. It had seemed like a crime to her then to kiss him, but what had? By now he was confused too. So Lacey apologized for her mistake, even though she might have misunderstood him, but the man had never kept someone close to him for such a thing. And he never would. Those bracelets did work like birth control, but Halid had only given them to her because he thought how beautiful they would look on her. Neither he nor the priestesses seemed to be able to explain it. Well, Lacey really was glad that it was just a misunderstanding, though it was up to the prince to talk about it. His eyes burned, waiting for her agreement, and the heroine's heart beat even faster. She was sure of her feelings now, and she longed for the same things he did. Now both couldn't hold back in the rush of passion, wanting to touch each other deeper. It was going to happen, and Lacey was already ready to experience an unpleasant feeling or even pain, though no, she was waiting for it. The man was infuriated by it because the girl always acted aloof in everything that concerned contract and relationship, so he took advantage of the moment. Each time his breath touched her skin and her body shuddered. It was as if Halid was teasing her, and yet he didn't even know her real name, but it seemed like she really would blab. But the man begged Nerys to call him by his name, and then he would definitely not hold back. Because of that fainting spell, Lacey thought she might have been thought strange because she had ruined her first impression. However, Halid reassured her because she had done well, perfect even. The girl fell right into his arms. Just like Simone had said, the dragon rarely showed interest in anyone, so no one in this world could compare to Lacey. Meanwhile, Madame kept repeating about how she didn't know where her actress was, that the Count was inquiring about. He did not believe that any trace of her had been lost without the help of Fiore's men. It seemed to him that everything had been a setup from the beginning, yet the actor had honored his request exactly according to the contract. Veronica did his best to fulfill his part. And now this old man wanted to kill her just because she was too good at the part. Everyone present had been trained personally by her to fulfill her duties, so Madame was put in an awkward position by the Count in front of them. Perhaps she should have started cleaning her customers. One of the apprentices pinned down the cocky man who kept rambling on about how it was impossible to disappear from the wanted list. So all that was left to say was that Veronica was dead. In any case, she would be taken off the list someday. Madame was glad that he had made concessions to her until he asked for one request. The Count wished to make sure that the actress never appeared in the country. Never. The woman marveled at how Lacey tolerated the rabble in general, but asked how much he was willing to pay. The price turned out to be equal to her head. Just as she thought, there was something about the counties that she didn't know about. Lacey was her highest paid actress. Moreover, she had every chance of succeeding her, so Madame hoped she wouldn't take it personally. The girl was always good, so she could attract any client. But all this time, they had been eavesdropped on. Madame pretended, as if she did not know what he wanted. Moreover, the stranger denied that he had been eavesdropping. According to him, he had simply come at the wrong time, though no one had noticed him anyway. She didn't like it when that nasty type came whenever he wanted. But if that was the case, she was the one who should have stayed out of his business. The instructor wanted to know where Lacey was. He'd picked the wrong person, though. Madame might have been able to threaten the Count. This man was different. Why was the man so obsessed with the protagonist? The guy knew that she was the only one who could help the wanted disappear, yet the woman kept playing dumb. She had prepared a ship for her to sail away, yet she was not there. So what she said was true. Lacey always surprised him. For this reason, the strange type was going to tell her again when they met. But will the protagonist want to see him again? He had some request in him as well. If the madam found out where his desired one was, she was sure to inform him. For the sake of such a thing, he was willing to pay whatever it took. It had indeed been a busy day. Given that the man hadn't said anything about her earring, he didn't know her abilities. Madame had given one to Lacey so she could disguise herself. And luckily, she was the only one who knew of the protagonist's other ability. She could use it to trace the location of the second earring, and this secret Madame would take with her to her grave. As her apprentice, the girl had clearly learned the lesson that to betray than to be betrayed. And yet, Lacey trusted the prince, so he didn't understand why she was drawing a line that she herself had crossed. He couldn't help himself, though. Her actions contradicted her words, but it brought them closer together. Her kisses and her smile made Halid's heart skip a beat, and that encounter with her joyful smile made the world stop. Her languid sighs seemed incredibly sweet. So close to her, the man's heart beat more often. His beloved Nereis didn't remember him, and didn't remember him, and didn't fully trust him. She didn't remember how their story began. 10 years ago, Lacey herself had asked him to come back and take her back exactly after this period of time. Her words had been both a salvation and a curse. Suddenly, his memories were interrupted by Simone, who asked for his attention. It had to do with the dungeon, specifically the prisoner who had committed suicide. Khalid shuddered and asked him to tell him everything on the way, and just at that moment, the protagonist began to be plagued by nightmares. She was dreaming about the same instructor, who was psychologically pressuring the girl, seeing how she was making progress. He taught her a technique that would trap her target if a special bond was established between them. At that moment, however, all she was thinking about was how to escape. Lacey hesitated, and that was something he hadn't taught her. But now, Simone told him that the captive had bitten off her tongue, so Khalid was angry that someone had pulled out the gag. The guards couldn't remember the last time they'd had wine, so the ceremony allowed them to relax. But even so, they should have been quieter because they could get their pay cut. By the way, they were the only ones forbidden to drink. At that moment, the woman began to make strange noises, as if she was vomiting. For this reason, one of the men pulled out a gag. They were afraid she would die before the interrogation. But the last was only her self-possessed grin. Khalid realized that coming home for 2 years had lifted someone's spirits. Simone, on the other hand, was apologizing because he couldn't prevent it, but the prince wasn't angry because the man couldn't keep track of everything. The captive definitely had an accomplice. There was no point in interrogating those guards now because they were too drunk, but there was no point in locking them up either because not all of them were guilty. Sana, on the other hand, took the blame on the guards because they were unable to control themselves and properly fulfill their duties, although he himself had not even touched alcohol. Khalid, on the other hand, did not want to torture all those who had served him all these long years because of a mere spy. He was not capable of such a thing. However, they should have focused on finding evidence now. The man spoke of his speculation, trying to figure out what had caused her action. Was it possible that she was killed as soon as they crossed the border? But why at that exact moment? If they used magic, there should have been traces left behind, so it would be worth looking for them. And while Khalid would be with the princess, Sana and Simone would take care of it. Except, the prince was transfixed by the mutants. After all, he was the only one with a full-fledged Teru, so it would be best if His Highness stayed on guard. It would be on Lana to guard the dungeon, especially since she was itching to do something already, though her brother doubted it would stop her from making trouble. Still, the prince was angry because he pulled his aide's cheek and asked him to watch more carefully. Meanwhile, a bright glow appeared in some dark room, which alerted the girl to the death of her captive. Now their master would be displeased, however she hoped that the death had not been in vain. It had been a week since they had crossed the border, so Lacey was free to enjoy the sea breeze and the sound of the waves, especially since the weather was perfect. Even while in her cabin, she could not worry about the weather, because now everyone could use magic. The main character didn't know that she could even use it to make repairs, so now Khalid's room looked different. Simone, on the other hand, wished to start today's lesson, which she was endlessly happy about. Fire, earth, water, and air. These are the 4 basic elements, and by possessing one of them, people could have different abilities. Simone had water magic and was able to heal others. Hearing this, he was pleased with her knowledge and even clapped his hands. Lacey continued talking, adding that Teru was born in the image of his master, which was also true. Maybe because Simone was so calm, his Teru was so adorable. The man said that magic couldn't be used in Weldon, and the reason was because it was done to maintain the balance of the lands. In the central continent where Weldon was located, magic ceased to exist, but in Irina it remained. All of this was decided by someone, and now it was possible to strike up a conversation about them. One Lacey had already met. It is a dragon, guarding the borders of the lands. The second was a tree that had taken root all over the world, and the third was a witch of the northern lands. The fourth was a holy green, hidden in a palace overgrown with thorn bushes. They were chosen to keep the balance of the lands. Therefore, they were nicknamed the Guardians. The Guardians stripped the central continent of magic. There was a strict ban on the spread of magic outside of Irina, and people were allowed to cross the border, but on the condition that they would not use magic. Khalid must have been an amazing person since he managed to keep Teru abroad, except, as Simone thought, his tiger was no ordinary tiger. However, why hadn't he immediately said he could put it to sleep if it scared the hell out of her? The prince possessed the element of wind, which was a bit strange because he was more suited to earth energy. Serious, hot, and towering majestically over everyone like a vast desert heated by the sun. Simone was glad to see that she liked His Highness, and it was a pity they couldn't take her out on deck because of the ban. Here, Lacey felt like a free bird because a cabin did not have even the slightest window. It turns out that the ship was something like a large magical artifact. Simone, however, had let her rest here from time to time, making her promise that no one would disturb her. Now nothing would surprise her, because the protagonist felt she had become stronger. She had another question. As a foreigner with no knowledge of magic or Teru, could she really marry Khalid, who was the crown prince? Simone, on the other hand, cut off that Lacey-possessed magic, even though she didn't feel it because she was born and raised on the other side. Plus, she had very strong water magic in her. Of course, she wanted to believe it, but it was hard. So, she would have to accept it as the truth, since she couldn't control the magic. Her kind words carried power, thankfully, and her emotions were stable. Lacey was rather calm, so magic didn't hurt her, but overusing it could turn tragic as magic was closely tied to emotions. And good words carried blessings and evil words carried harm. So, the protagonist wondered how she could learn to turn magic into Teru, something that was usually taught in families as a child. Simone, on the other hand, suggested that she ask Khalid for it because only a close relationship could help with that. In principle, it was logical because her situation was special. Even though Lacey didn't remember her father, she still had memories of her mother, who had loved her despite her difficult life. She didn't remember those feelings in the hug either. Except that the girl had definitely been born in Weldon, even though there was no magic there. As it turned out, there were people who had moved there for their own reasons. Right now, only Khalid could help her. They had opposite elements, so it was unclear how there could be synastry between them. Suddenly, they were interrupted. It was Sana who had caught someone. She fell to her knees, begging for forgiveness from Her Highness. Though Lacey herself was worried about the girl, while Simon was ready to vaporize her. He was already choosing how he would teach the twin a lesson, suggesting throwing her into the ocean, hanging her upside down, or even locking her in an oak barrel overnight. The poor girl was trembling with fear, but fortunately, the princess didn't want to do that. Suddenly, the protagonist noticed a magical translation artifact around her neck. Because of the ban, it activated as soon as they crossed the border. That was how she was able to understand the words of that song. It was fun to find out that the thing could even translate swear words. Just 10 minutes ago, Lacey had asked Simon if her element was compatible with Khalid's, to which the man had replied, thinking that their connection was special. His face had turned into a tomato at that thought. Their conversation was interrupted by the strange rumors that were being issued by Lana, who seemed to the protagonist rather sharp on the tongue. However, it was funny. Fire began to emanate from the twin, so Lacey assumed it was her Terra. For some reason, the girl was silent, so Simon tried to intervene. It turned out to be true. Mentally, the heroine was worried because she thought she was horrible for showing what she thought was such a disgusting Thera to the princess. Simon wanted to quickly change the subject, however Lacey stepped closer to the bully. She liked what she saw. Moreover, the flames reminded her of wings, so the princess wished to touch them. A slight smile graced her face while Lana was embarrassed. She had seen her from afar, but who knew she would get the chance to see Lacey up close? The protagonist was already playing with the fire, which was nice and warm, as if she was trying to tame it. Turning away from the interesting ability, she asked the girl's name. Lana herself sank into thought, as her mana hadn't been this stable in a long time, and then she cried. The guys she was chasing and couldn't believe their eyes, but the girl pulled herself together in time. And again, she began to talk about her shortcomings, wiping away her tears, but she had a desire to become a personal knight of the princess, which Lana said. Simon interrupted her because there was no such thing as a knight in iron, so the heroine didn't know what she was talking about, but the twin was adamant. In her opinion, it was an alternative to the guards, especially since she just wanted to protect the princess. But Khalid's right hand was covered with goosebumps when she touched it, as if she could drive herself into the grave with such permissiveness. He didn't even manage to entice her with the position of commander of the border guard unit, though, because there were already sparks burning in Lana's eyes. Meanwhile, her brother was waddling towards Khalid, who was inquiring about the guards' reports, in which they found nothing noteworthy. Moreover, they hadn't found anything during the search either, which was strange. There were only two explanations. Either the prisoner was extremely careful, or her accomplice was too skillful. Khalid asked them to wait for a while, as they had to make sure that the mutants didn't show up first. Fortunately, nothing had happened yet. for the guards had been reinforced, but they could not let their guard down. They had to get to Iron without incident, for the future crown princess was on the port,